Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is 50 Weeks That Shaped America, our series looking at some of the most fascinating and consequential stories in American history, all part of marking 250 years of American history. And this week, week 13, we go to April 1917, Washington, D.C. One reporter noted that it was a, quote, soft, fragrant rain of early spring that was enveloping the city that day, and President Woodrow Wilson spent the morning playing golf. Then he had dinner with his family around 6:30 p.m., where he would later say that they talked about everything but the grave matter at hand. And then, around 8:20, a black car pulls up in front of the White House, takes him over to Congress, where he delivered a speech announcing that the United States would formally enter World War I. And that is the focus of this week's series, the decision to enter the war and what it said about how the U.S. saw itself in the world, isolationism, a robust peace movement, Woodrow Wilson versus Teddy Roosevelt, and yes, a lot of talk of, quote, America first. Here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hey there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
So before we really get into this story, in 30 seconds, and either of you can take this, can you please explain for our listeners the cause of World War I and how it really kicked off? And your time starts now.
Well, look, they shot Franz Ferdinand.
And then some stuff happened?
And then people lost their shit, and the entire continent collapsed into war. You don't need more details than that.
Pretty good.
Yeah. It's complicated.
It is very complicated. I will confess that I listened to The Rest is History's brilliant series. Their work is always brilliant, but they're brilliant, many part series on the outbreak of World War I. I think it came out last year. And I listened to it. I was riveted. And then at the end, I was like, I still don't really get it. But maybe that's the point. But look, listeners, maybe we'll give you a little time right now to go and brush up on the real causes of World War I. Because we're going to take a little ad break and you can gather your notes and your research. And going into the break, let me remind listeners that if you want the full ad-free access to all of our episodes, the way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber to our newsletter. You get the full newsletter, full audio and video sent to you on Sundays. Lots of bonus conversations. There's even a special podcast feed we've set up for subscribers so you can listen in whatever podcast app you're already using. And of course, you're supporting our work throughout this America 250 year. So head on over to thisdaypod.com and you'll see a link to join. I actually realized, I don't know when I wrote this, but the link on our website says join or die, which I appreciated.
A little aggressive, but
a little aggressive, but $7 a month,
Just a tad hostile.
thisdaypod.com. Either way, we will be back after these ads with breakout of the war in Europe and the pressure it put on American politics. All right, we're back. You don't have to explain the outbreak of World War I. And again, I think the focus here is really the conversation in the United States and what it said about how the U.S. saw itself on the world stage. But for what it's worth, war in Europe, as we said, Franz Ferdinand assassinated in June of 1914. The war had been raging since August of 1914. We're kind of pinning ourselves here a little bit later in the 1916 into 1917. But President Woodrow Wilson had declared formal U.S. neutrality in 1914, and a lot of Americans kind of didn't see it as their war. They didn't see any reason to entangle themselves in what they viewed as a very complicated European quarrel. That said, the war goes on for years and years. It spreads and spreads, and it cannot be ignored by a lot of Americans. In part, and this is some of the context I think is worth laying out here, there are so many newly arrived immigrants in this country. We've talked about this here a couple times already on this series, but there are a lot of Germans in this country who are connected to what's happening in Europe. There's a lot of Irish Americans who are thinking of the war through the lens of the Irish-British conflict and seeing the UK's role in the war. So, I guess it's silly to say the U.S. can't ignore it, but I do find it fascinating that people do feel, as much as there was that talk of this is not our war, there was also a lot of Americans who felt a direct personal connection to what was happening.
Absolutely.
Because you had lots of German and Irish immigrants that had come in like the 1840s, 1850s. But by 1914, 1915, you also have tons of new immigrants from Italy, from Russia, from the former Austro-Hungarian Empire that's going to be falling apart during the course of this war. And so it's people whose families still live in the places that are at war, who they probably saw like a decade or two ago. And so there's a real sense that even though they may be beginning to see themselves as Americans, their hearts are also with their home countries.
Yeah, I would say that there's a real sort of identity split in that you still have these ethnic groups that are very much living within their own isolated ethnic groups. So you might be in America, but if you're living in a German town or in a German neighborhood or an Irish neighborhood, you're speaking your native language or your mother tongue, you may feel that divide very intimately in terms of like how you think of yourself, how you're interacting with others, what you talk about, sort of at the water cooler. These are not just sort of like incidents in which you're thinking about someone from years ago. You're thinking about a mother that might still be there or a sibling who might still be there.
Yeah.
My mom grew up in a German-American community where like the streets were all still Stadts and where up through World War I, everyone was still speaking German. There were German language newspapers. That was the norm in a lot of cities and towns across America.
It's funny, part of the effect of this war in Europe being so convoluted and factional is probably that every single little faction here in the U.S. had some entry point into the war, right? So you can see how it's grabbed everyone's attention. That said, and this is one of the big through lines, I think, of this story for me, it is hard to overstate how much the reluctance to get involved, both for isolationist reasons, which we will obviously discuss, but also just for anti-war reasons, is a huge part of this story. And that is just the pressure that ends up falling on Woodrow Wilson's soldiers. But I point to a song by the name of I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, which was released in 1914, became a national hit in 1915, 650,000 copies sold. It's the number one song in the country in the spring of 1915. And this song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, basically comes out of the pacifist movement in this country. And we'll circle back to the kind of state of the pacifist movement and how it interacted with the more isolationist movements and obviously the pro-war factions. But the other element to really lay in here and, talk about stuff that I feel like I've learned over the course of making this podcast, which is, if you're looking for an explanation for why big things happen, a lot of times real-time political pressures are a really good place to explain things. And guess what's happening? There's an election year on the horizon. So I do think we should take a moment to talk about the fact that in 1916, there is an election, just as this conversation about the war is sort of coming to a head. And maybe this is a time to meet a couple of the key players in that election. First and foremost, the sitting president, Woodrow Wilson. So, Woodrow Wilson, welcome to 50 Weeks That Shaped America.
Woodrow Wilson, wow. Somebody who, if you are interested in 20th century history, you've really got to have a handle on. He is an interesting political figure because he really is a scholar. He comes up, he's the son of a Presbyterian minister. He's born and raised in Virginia in the segregated South. But then he goes and he gets his PhD from Johns Hopkins. He will go on to become the president of Princeton University. And he is he's a political scientist. Like he writes a dissertation on Congress. And so he's thinking about government. And he's also a progressive reformer. So he ends up running for the governorship of New Jersey. And he comes in there as the kind of reform candidate, and that's what sets him up to eventually become president after the 1912 election. We won't go into all of the ins and outs of the 1912 election, but suffice to say, the Republican Party had split between its conservative faction, which would remain in the Republican Party, and the progressive faction led by Theodore Roosevelt, which would break off and form its new party, the Progressive or the Bull Moose Party. And ultimately, that third party and that third party candidate, Teddy Roosevelt, come in second in the 1912 election. The Republican Party comes in third, and the sitting president, Taft, come in third. But Wilson wins because the Republican Party is split. And he brings that reformism and that piety and that Wilsonness into office with him. And as close as the 1912 election was, in 1916, he knows he's kind of in for an uphill battle for his reelection campaign, because if the Republican Party reunites, he's got a problem.
Yeah.
And now there's this specter of war that is just applying a ton of pressure on him.
I would also say that Woodrow Wilson's, yes, he's a politician, he's the president, but he's a scholar. He really is someone who's thinking critically and carefully about like every single thing that has to happen. And for him, it's really hard to reckon like, I might be a leader that has to take the country into war. And that's completely different than thinking about, policy at the national level or different things that, he might be prepared for. So it's a huge thing on his plate. I think he has huge reservations about being the leader that will do this.
Yeah.
Not saying he feels unqualified, but I do think that him being sort of like the president's scholar is a different sort of leader than someone who's already been trained as a soldier, someone who's already experienced war in some form or fashion.
Somebody like Teddy Roosevelt.
Somebody like Teddy Roosevelt. Who, obviously, there's a huge contrast there. But we've done a lot of episodes about Wilson. We're talking mostly here about his policy and his thinking as regards World War I. I do think it is worth, if we're trying to understand the man, we should talk about, how he's dealing with some of the major domestic issues, including race relations. And we've done an episode in the past about that visit that black activist William Monroe Trotter made to the White House in 1914 to basically tell Wilson, like, hey, like, get off your ass. Like, we got to deal with this. And I don't, without going too far down that rabbit hole, I think the sketch you just laid out, Kelly, of him as someone who's very eager to think and a little reluctant to kind of put 10 toes down and take a stand. And I don't know if that's a sort of disposition thing, or you could say that he has a lack of like real moral clarity, but obviously it's sort of manifesting itself apparently on all fronts.
Yeah. And he's a racist.
And he's a racist. Maybe that is where he's willing to take a stand, but yeah.
I mean, in terms of just like, he is the first president from the South since the Civil War. And so I think he definitely has a geographical perspective that puts him a little bit different from someone like Roosevelt, who is sort of in the North and very much progressive about his ideas. And so Woodrow Wilson is not, he's much more, we say racist, but reserved in the way that he thinks about race and in the way that he sort of approaches these really expansive ideas.
And he'll waffle a lot, as we'll talk about, as the U.S. Navigates this road to war. But he also has to take into account public opinion, and the public is not interested in getting involved in this war. And it's not clear that Wilson is particularly interested in changing their minds about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you did mention, Nikki, good old Teddy Roosevelt, I think first appearance on our series as well. So let's get to know him a little bit. But I will also say it's this funny thing where we're sort of framing this in the guise of the 1916 election. Roosevelt doesn't run in the 16 election, but it's sort of weird. It kind of does feel like it's still Wilson versus Roosevelt, as we'll lay out.
Well, and he doesn't run, but he does a trial balloon. He actually comes out and he says, well, I'm not going to run because actually this nation isn't brave enough for me to lead it as president, because if I were president, I would lead us into war, and you all don't want that, so you don't get me.
So still pay attention to me, but I don't have to go ahead and run and potentially lose again.
But I mean, this is so much the essence of Teddy Roosevelt. He grew up as a sickly child and spent a lot of time reading, and then sort of through mental will, sort of forcing himself into physical toughness. He's somebody who's kind of obsessed with masculinity and virility and strength. And he means that both in terms of a man's physical body, but also the man's physical body as a kind of stand-in for national strength. And he thinks that war is a big part of that. He goes and he leads troops, the Rough Riders in Cuba, quite famously. This is what makes him this famed national figure, all that courage on the battlefield. He believes that war is important to the renewal of the national life. He'll later say that he detests war, but he is always ready to go.
He's kind of obsessed with war.
Yeah,
I mean, like, he reminds me of like, this sounds so bad, but like manosphere people today, where they're like doing MMA and the UFC and always trying to like, they want to fight. You know what I mean? They want to be able to like engage and show that they have, I don't know, these muscles, manhood, whatever. But that's a huge part of his identity is, like even as a president, he brings in like jiu-jitsu people to teach everyone how to do jiu-jitsu and has them teaching at the Naval Academy. Like, he's just obsessed with fighting and war and being prepared and having a strong defense is his whole thing.
But unlike the manosphere people, that is hooked to a progressive politics. And that's what makes him kind of interesting in this moment. So he is the one who's out there, again, like he shares a lot politically with Wilson, frankly. He's closer to them than he is to Taft, who had been his vice president. But he had been the youngest president in history, I think, at the time. He was 42 after McKinley was assassinated, and he ascended to the presidency. He serves 2 terms. And then he is a gadfly for the entirety of the Wilson administration, constantly urging him to get more involved, calling him cowardly for not wanting to enter the war, and trying to gin up support for U.S. involvement. He thinks, if nothing else, the U.S. should be prepared to go to war.
Yes.
And this is his criticism of him. He's like, okay, maybe I can't win the case that the U.S. should be like actively involved in this war. But he says during the campaign, President Wilson's ignoble shirking of responsibility has been clothed in an utterly misleading phrase, the phrase of a coward. He kept us out of war. In actual reality, war has been creeping nearer and nearer, and we face it without policy, plan, purpose, or preparation. And so his basic argument is that war is coming whether we like it or not. You can't just like wish your way out of a war. And now we're not even going to be prepared for when that day inevitably comes.
And look, I admire a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, but just in the course of this story, I mean, just the positioning and the sort of having it all ways that he has in this moment where he can lob these criticisms and not be an actual power, not running for an actual position, so not actually maybe have to think about the real world consequences of this or how this would actually play out in practicality. He's basically, if it were today, he would be a podcaster, right? He'd be someone who would just be ranting and raving and talking about all the problems and never having to take that tangible step towards like, well, how do we actually address this stuff?
And historically, Teddy Roosevelt, even his Rough Riders, they have high casualty numbers.
Yes.
They die a lot. A lot of men die under Roosevelt's watch.
And he doesn't actually win that many elections. It's funny. I didn't realize we were going to be talking so much smack about Teddy Roosevelt here, but
you tapped into something.
Yeah. Look, something you said, Kelly, about I think you sort of said it as a joke, but it's like, for someone who proclaims that he hates war, he keeps getting into all these little scraps. But that is an important framing. And I want to start to lay out some of the big ideas that are floating around and lanes that are developing as we then start to get into the ramp up to the war. But, I think there is in Roosevelt an idea that like, peace through war, right? That we have to project strength in order to not then get attacked or in order to not get pulled into messy conflicts. So there's that idea. Then there's like this whole preparedness argument, which I think is extremely strong, which is, we don't want to, as you said, we don't want to get into this war, but the war is coming to us and we have to spend this time getting prepared. There are some voices that are saying, let's go out there and jump in and dive into this war. There is obviously the isolationist idea that that's not our problem. We'll sort of lay that out a little bit. Some of that gets couched in the America First. And then, as I said in the intro, there is a kind of like active voices for peace. But those are the kind of main lanes that seem to be emerging in the conversation around the war. And all of it, obviously falls on Wilson's shoulders. So both in the context of the election, but also just in the context of his thinking, it really feels like from the spring of 1915 through the election, which he does win, it's sort of close, but, I think he kind of has it. Towards the end, he kind of pulls away from Charles Evan Hughes and wins re-election. But the way the war is playing out really applies more and more pressure to him. And kind of what is your sense of his evolution from America First, isolationist? It really feels like this conversation about, well, we need to be prepared, whether you like it or not, starts to really get in his head.
I mean, I mentioned before that like Wilson is the scholar, that he's constantly thinking critical about things, almost like has sort of like a lawyer aspect to him where he's like, the basis of neutrality is not indifference. It's not self-interest. Like the basis of neutrality is sympathy for mankind. It's fairness. It's goodwill. And all of this sounds very good. The way that we are supposed to think about war and this isolationist stance is not because we're being callous. It's strategic. And I think that framing sort of gives him peace about how he's able to sort of make sense of his own decisions. But the point is coming where he can no longer really take that stance because the war is coming to him whether he wants it or not. And within the next few weeks and certainly months, he's got to make hard decisions, especially when the United States starts getting attacked.
Yeah.
I think just to linger on that for just a second, Kelly, his America First idea, you're so right that he's like very careful to make clear that he doesn't see it as selfishness. He does say like America first. So we think of America before Europe. But then he says we do that so that we can be there for Europe when this war is over and help them rebuild. So he frames it in this very benevolent and sort of like we're doing this for your own good kind of way. And the only reason that I want to underline that is because it's so important to the moral language that Wilson will wrap around his thinking and his actions. Like he will put all of this in distinctly moral terms. And that's less the scholar and more the Presbyterian minister's son coming out of him.
That's really fascinating. And it also is reflective, I think, of, by this point in U.S. history, I think there is a sort of baseline expectation that the U.S. has a big role in the world. And so the conversation is more about kind of what is that role and how do we frame that rather than like we're just not going to get involved. That's not their problem. And so his framing of it as we're going to be there in a leadership role after they figure out their squabbles is really interesting. But the squabbles inevitably bring the U.S. into the fray. And, I'm going to say a phrase that is another one of those like, it was a little sidebar in your history book in ninth grade or whatever, but the sinking of the Lusitania. May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat sinks a British passenger ship, the RMS Lusitania, off the southern coast of Ireland. But on board are 128 Americans who are killed among the 1,200 overall killed. And this really is the moment where all of a sudden Wilson can't just say, not our problem.
I think it's important to note that these aren't American ships. This is a British ship, but the British ship has all of this ammunitions on it. The Germans clearly see this ship as a threat and are very strategic in taking it out, whether there are American lives on there or not. And so Wilson is trying to put an end to this, to try to say like, okay, we can't, I understand, but you cannot target these ships with civilians, these ships with Americans on it. And the German government, they're trying to, again, reach an impasse that won't bring the United States into war. Germany at first kind of concedes a little bit, and this angers a lot of German officials. There's one naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who basically resigns. He was like, this is not how we do war. Like, we cannot make these kinds of concessions. And a lot of U.S. experts on the other side are saying, this is only going to be a Band-Aid. This is temporary. So there are some efforts to try to create peace between the United States and Germany, but they just keep falling apart. And there's not a lot of progress that's being made. One German ambassador to the United States said, like, peace is on the floor waiting to be picked up, like pleading for people to sort of come to some sort of agreement. But these U-boats keep attacking these ships. And Wilson realizes that this is an act of war. We cannot stop this. We are going to have to get involved. And that really comes to, I think, a fray when you get the infamous Zimmerman telegram.
So over the course of 1916, there are these attempts to like have some sort of peace, not get involved, maybe let have Germany sort of dials back a little bit some of the U-boat attacks. By the end of 16, it really does seem to be falling apart. I mean, is that mostly because Germany's just like ramping up these attacks again?
Yes. I mean, the war is not going great for Germany. And one of the German assets are these U-boats. And so they've been, all of 1916, they're restraining their use of their boats, their water warfare because of the United States. And they're getting desperate. I mean, this is why the German ambassador is like, we've got to find a way out of this because if we can't come to some sort of deal with the U.S., we're going to have to start using these U-boats again, and that's going to draw the U.S. into war. And the things are happening like so quickly once they start happening. So the U-boat attacks resume at the very end of January 1917, and the writing is just on the wall at that point in time. And Kelly, do you want to talk about this Zimmerman telegram? Because I feel like that's the thing that makes it impossible to sort of put the cork back in the bottle for U.S. public sentiment, which with the U-boat attacks, after people are starting to unravel themselves a little bit when they feel like Americans are the victims of this war.
Absolutely. So the British, intercept a telegram that's sent by a German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to his ambassador in Mexico. And the telegram basically says, hey, we want to explore an alliance with the Mexican government in the event that when we go to war with the United States, that Mexico will be our ally. And when this is sent, Woodrow Wilson sends the telegram to the press. The American public explodes with outrage. Like the idea that Mexico would be in alliance with Germany, that the war might literally come to their front door, that this might no longer be something that's like isolated on the oceans, but literally a ground war in the United States because of the proximity of Mexico is terrifying. And right after that, like the next following, not even the next month, but the next couple weeks, you start to get a series of just torpedoed ships over and over and over again. On March 16th, you have the steamship Valencia. It's a 4,000-ton ship that gets torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. You have about 15 lives lost. Then the very next day, you have the steamship, the city of Memphis, which also is sunk. And then the very next day, you have the steamship Illinois tanker that is also sunk by bombs. Then April 1st, armed American merchant ship, the SS Aztec, gets torpedoed and sunk, and it kills 28 people on its crew, a U.S. Navy Armed Guard sailor. He's the first American naval serviceman killed in war. And now we are in it.
Yeah. We did an episode about the Zimmermann telegram, and maybe we'll rerun that on Sunday. It's just a very fascinating little side quest. And it's a little crazy to think like, oh my gosh, Mexico is going to cut a deal with Germany and let German troops roll through Mexico and maybe even supply. But I also just want to point out the Mexican-American War was basically a generation before this, not that long ago. And so the idea that like that border was still very porous and contested, and that the United States like doesn't have these sort of hard borders around itself, I think is still in people's minds for sure. And so I think that plays into that idea as well, and that sort of sense of vulnerability.
Yeah, because in that telegram, Germany's like, and if we win, you get your land back.
Yeah, land back. Yeah. I mean, look, we're one generation removed from the Civil War. We're one generation removed from the Mexican-American War. I mean, things still feel very unstable for the U.S. And obviously, as Europe falls apart, people are kind of asking some big questions here as well. So you have this drumbeat of attacks. It's applying pressure and pressure and pressure. Starting in the spring and summer of 1916, Wilson hasn't formally declared our entry into the war, but he has to really grapple with this preparedness question. And so the National Defense Act grows, the Army, they start to recruit. There's now have 175,000 Army, 400,000 National Guard troops. It is worth pointing out, and this maybe is an interesting little side quest at some point, but there were a lot of people who were actually already kind of joining the fight. You had Americans going to Canada and joining Canadian forces who were part of the war. Just we're starting to get more and more involved. February 17, Wilson breaks diplomatic ties with Germany, and the pressure is ramping up and ramping up and ramping up. I want to take half a step back from the kind of ramp up to war, which is all culminating towards this speech that Wilson gives in the spring of 17, and return to these factions and these sort of ideological battles that are taking place. So let's talk a little bit first and foremost about this idea of preparedness. Teddy Roosevelt, I think, is the main voice for that. He actually writes two books, one in 1915 and one in 16, called America and the World War is the one in 15, and then one in 1916 is Fear God and Take Your Own Part. It's quite the title.
Much better title on the second one. That one's going to fly off the shelves.
Yeah. But what is the argument around preparedness? As you see it, what is the line between preparedness and involvement?
That is the question.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question.
Listen, preparedness, you draw a straight line to the military-industrial complex. Like, I feel like there's no way you can get sort of prepared without the U.S. having to spend an exorbitant amount of money in its weaponry, in preparing its soldiers, in its navy and its ships. I mean, this is a huge investment because you can't prepare without spending the money to do all of these things. And a lot of American soldiers and those who will subsequently sign up later, they're not prepared for war. They're not trained for war. And Roosevelt is saying, like, get your men ready.
I think there is kind of this historical answer to your question, Jody, which is I don't think we've ever had a preparedness drive that didn't end in war.
Yeah.
Right? That it
True.
creates a kind of, you would say it's like a path dependency. Like once you start to
Yeah.
increase the military capacity of the state, that capacity is going to be used. And if it's not used abroad, it's going to be used at home. If you think about the war on terror and the ways that that sort of generated violence back into the state. But also it could be just be like, if you have a robust preparedness movement, that means that the population is already moving toward an embrace of or an acceptance of this idea that the country is going to go to war, that you're already on that inevitable path. And preparedness is just one of the signposts along the way that this is going to happen. And certainly in this case, I mean, you're in 1916. The war has been going on in Europe for 2 years. You're in the middle of a presidential campaign where the slogan for Wilson is "He kept us out of war." But at the same time, you have this National Defense Act that, again, as Kelly was saying, like starts ramping up the military-industrial complex. And so on the one hand, you have him saying, "I kept us out of war," and on the other hand, the nation is putting itself on war footing.
Yeah. I mean, I like both of you using that phrase, military-industrial complex. I don't think that phrase would come into use until Eisenhower, 40 years after this?
Yeah.
But 30, 40 years after this. But, Roosevelt is coming off of these colonial excursions into the Philippines, into Cuba, into other parts of Latin America. I think there is a sense that, like, this is what we do. We have the capacity to do this. Once you have it, once we've sort of built up all these systems, we're not just going to sort of like dial it back, right? And so it's a little bit of a hammer looking for a nail kind of thing. And so you couch it in the form of preparedness, but we all know kind of where that's going to lead to. Other factions, there were certainly voices, and a lot of them are coming from the sort of traditional Anglophile Northeastern establishment, who were actually saying, like, let's go in. We have an obligation to just dive right into this war. A lot of it was framed in a kind of idea of a lasting alliance with Britain. But, you have the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, Senators Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts and Eli Root of New York. But they're kind of prominent voices for like, hey, we should actually go and, back the British in this conflict. And this is the part that I kind of think is often lost to history. You have isolationist voices who are saying, America first, this is not our problem. Let the rest of the world figure it out. But I think sometimes, and there's been historians who have argued this, I think pretty convincingly, that the idea of isolationism and the notion of framing the like voices against war as isolationist maybe does drown out the idea that there were actually active voices that were pro-peace. And I do want to spend some time talking about the fact that there were a lot of robust anti-war voices, and it was very diverse, a lot of new immigrants, but there was a real kind of massive peace coalition in this country that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation about the run-up to the war.
Probably the biggest pacifist movement that the U.S. has ever seen before or after. I mean, this really is a deeply organized, philosophically grounded movement that sees war as a relic of the old world, and that the United States has become technologically and sort of civilizationally advanced enough to not need it anymore. Some of this is the aftermath of the Civil War, but a lot of this is the progressive movement. The progressive movement has within it, obviously, people like Teddy Roosevelt, but it also has a very large contingent of anti-war activists, a lot of them women, actually. And this is actually going to be part of the drive for women's suffrage in the 19-teens. Is like, we are the moral leaders in politics, and one of the signs of our moral leadership is that we don't want to throw hundreds of thousands of bodies into a war. And that's
Can I also
argument.
say that there is an ethical question that has to sort of grapple with new weaponry. So World War I is the first war to have like poisonous gas.
Yeah.
And the idea that you could kill large swaths of people and keep buildings intact is something that people are like, wait a second, like, how are we using these weapons? To what end will wars become something that just annihilate people altogether? That we are playing too dangerously close to God or to these ideas that war is so harmful and violent that we may not be able to come back from the brink of
Mm-hmm.
that. We can't pull that back. And I mean, there are a lot of weapons that also get banned after World War One. Like poisonous gas is one of those things. It's like, hey, we're no longer going to use these kinds of weapons of war. But I think that's a big part of how people are seeing, like, the ways that people are dying is terrifying to people, especially once you get aviation as well.
Yeah. So some of the voices who are in the mix as pacifist voices, you have Jane Addams, who's a very prominent pacifist. She founds the Women's Peace Party in 1915. It's worth noting that she kind of squared this idea of isolation. She didn't consider herself an isolationist. She said, no, there's a sort of global peace movement, and the U.S. has a role in that, and we need to connect to other countries around the idea of peace, not around the idea of war. There were people in office. I mean, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned because he was kind of saw the march towards war. Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette, and I think you can draw a line from that kind of progressive Wisconsin Midwest ethos all the way to today. But, he was very suspicious of the intersection between big business and the war effort.
He's not wrong.
No, he's not wrong. Jeanette Rankin, who, people may know that name because there's now buildings named for her in Washington, D.C. She was the first woman elected to the House of Representatives, but she was, a suffragist, obviously, but then she was a member of the Women's Peace Party. And there are sort of complicated coalitions here as well. So Henry Ford was out there at this moment. I think we have a sense of some of Henry Ford's ideas, but he was out there also talking about some pretty weird ideas about peace. But in 1915, he launched a peace mission to Europe. He got a boat and took it over there.
What did he do? A peace ship.
A peace ship.
Yeah. He pulls together his little peace ship
Put a bunch of
that he is
activists on
going
it.
to sail across the ocean as a sign of this commitment to peace. There's a lot of it just goes badly from the very start. The activists that he brings aboard are fighting amongst themselves. Very funny for peace activists. There's the press is making fun of them, making little snide remarks like I just did. There's an outbreak of influenza on the boat. So that's not great.
We
We're
haven't
on the
even
verge of
mentioned
the Spanish
influenza.
flu.
But yeah.
Oh, influenza. Yes.
Yeah.
My goodness. Yeah. By the time they get over there, they're all beleaguered from the flu and physically ill. That it's actually, this was not the best idea.
Yeah. Look, we eventually go to war, and I want to get to Wilson's sort of final turning point and the speech he gives. But is there an argument that the peace movement did, at least for a couple years, forestall this and really introduce the idea of peace and pacifism into the mainstream discourse?
Not only does it do that, I mean, it's successful in keeping the U.S. out of the war for a significant amount of time. You mentioned that song at the very beginning of the show, and part of that is shaping a culture for pacifism is too strong a word for how Americans were acting, but for a peace movement, there was some real support for that. But it also shapes the terms of what come after, right? This idea that you can outlaw war, that you can build world governance, that you can adjudicate your way around future conflicts, just as much as they are, I think, holding the U.S. back, creating enough public pressure that Wilson cannot embrace the war prior to his reelection. But they're also going to have some knock-on consequences going into the end of the war in the 1920s.
Yeah. Okay. This brings us back to the first couple of days of April 1917 when Wilson finally makes the decision, okay, we're going to enter this war. I don't think there's a single breaking point. I just think it's this accumulation of pressure and this understanding. But it is the case that he kind of then has to steel himself and say, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it for real. And there's an apocryphal story, I think, but a journalist by the name of Frank Cobb, who was also a Wilson supporter, claims that he met with Wilson on the afternoon of April 1st. This would be the day before he gives his speech, and said that Wilson told him, to fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality is going to enter the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, and the man on the street. Now, historians have kind of pointed out that, none of the White House records show that Frank Cobb visited the White House on that day, but nevertheless, I think there's this idea that Wilson understands the gravity of the moment, but knows that we have to make this terrible, brutal calculus in this choice. So end of March, first couple of days of April, Wilson starts to write his speech. It took 3 days to compose it on a typewriter this time, unlike a couple weeks ago when we talked about Abraham Lincoln cutting out little scraps of paper and re-gluing them to that page. He's on a typewriter. He's by all accounts, procrastinating. He's hanging a lot with his wife. We mentioned that he played pool and golf a lot in this time. But, he forces himself to write this speech. He's alone in his office. He's reading reports of the war, editorials in the Times, often urging him to take action. He would write an outline, compose his thoughts in shorthand, and then take it into longhand, then type it up. He attends church on April 1st. Comes home, finishes the speech on his Hammond typewriter, hands it off to the public printer where copies are made and distributed to the press. We're back now at that morning of April 2nd, 1917, that soft, fragrant rain pouring over Washington, D.C. He goes and plays golf. Good for him. He plays golf that morning. Why not? Congress meets at noon. They have a lot of other sort of stuff to attend to, but everyone knows what's really coming is this evening Wilson is going to give this speech. He has dinner with his family and his main advisor, Colonel Edward M. House. During the meal, House reports that we talked about everything except for the matter at hand. At 8:20, a black Cadillac limousine picks up Wilson and his wife and, accompanied by a few others, drives out of the executive mansion gate over to the Capitol. He enters the building and first goes into a sort of room to the side to compose himself. And he didn't know it, but apparently an editor for Atlantic Monthly, Ellery Sedgwick, who is also in the room. But Sedgwick, he kind of recognizes that Wilson doesn't see him, so he slinks off to the side so that he can get a view. And Sedgwick, who knows how much we can believe this, but afterwards writes that Wilson walked up to a mirror and stared at it for a few moments. And Sedgwick says that he saw the president's, quote, chin shaking and his face flushed. And so maybe that's just a writer being a little purple in their prose, but I do think it paints a picture of someone who is really grappling with this moment. We're going to bring this episode to a close now and pick up the actual speech the next episode. But I'm curious for the two of you. We're seeing a portrait here of a man who is genuinely unsure and reluctant, and maybe a more charitable way to describe it is sort of steeling himself and realizing the gravity of his decision. But what do you make, especially going back to the sort of picture we painted of him as an academic first and foremost and a thinker first and foremost? What do you think of this moment where he has to make this grave decision?
He has a real sense of history.
Yeah, I think he knows lives are going to be lost, that there are many more Americans that will sacrifice their lives for this cause, and that will fall on him, that will fall on his head. And that's a heavy weight to bear. Even no matter how just the cause is, knowing that war brings death, I think is something really hard to grapple with. And you want to make sure that you exhausted every single avenue you could have to prevent this. But he really doesn't have a choice, and he's got to not just enter this war, but also prove to the United States that he is capable of guiding them through it.
I think he feels the momentousness of the moment and the weight of the decision that he has made. Right? He knows that it is going to change the country. It's going to change his legacy. And I think, again, that that language of morality that he uses when he speaks about this war, that he speaks about politics more generally, like there is a kind of, not just a sense of history, but a sense of being ordained for this moment. He's not going to talk in the kind of fire and brimstone language of later preachers, but he feels the portent, and I think he senses a kind of the hand of God involved in some way. And so I think that increases his sense of momentumness in that period right before the speech.
Yeah, though it makes me realize that when we get into the speech next episode, maybe we can compare it to another "we're going to war" speech that we've already done on this series, where we heard, George W. Bush talk about an axis of evil, which certainly framed things in these larger terms. To my mind, Wilson's speech is a little more, as you said, pragmatic, and a little more reluctant, and maybe a little less couched in kind of that those grand terms. But I don't know. We'll get into that speech next episode. Of course, listeners, if you want that episode right now, you can go become a paying subscriber to our newsletter. You can find that link at thisdaypod.com, where you get all sorts of other great stuff and, of course, support our work. But either we will be back next episode with the speech, the fallout, and the legacy. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It's 50 Weeks That Shaped America, Week 13, Part 2, on the debate and the decision over the U.S. involvement in World War I. We ended last episode with President Wilson finally, reluctantly making the decision to formally enter the war. We talked about the various political and moral factions, the robust peace movement, and of course the voices like Teddy Roosevelt saying, stop being such a coward, let's do this thing and get ready and go to war. Well, here we are, April 2nd, 1917. Wilson gets in his car, escorted by cavalry, enters the congressional chamber a little after 8:30. It is packed, standing room only. This episode will look at the address he delivered, the fallout, and the legacy of the U.S. intervention into that First World War. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, what does Wilson say that night? I mentioned it's a packed house. Obviously, every elected official is there. The Supreme Court justices are there in the front row. He walks in. They start applauding pretty soon. How does he start to make the case?
So Wilson starts the speech kind of outlining everything that had happened in the previous few months. He talks about the U-boat attacks. He talks about the spies attacking the United States, the hospital ships, the relief supply vessels, and he calls it a warfare against mankind, and that this war has already been started against the United States, and the U.S. has a choice. They can ignore it or they cannot ignore it, and it's actually the wrong path to just submit and to suffer these continued attacks, that the U.S. has to stand up for itself. So he goes to Congress and he says, look, the Germans have declared war against us, so it's time for us to fight back.
He uses a phrase that's worth pointing out, especially given where we are now, but he says, he doesn't say, I'm taking us to war. He says, I advise that the Congress declare the most recent course of Imperial German government. Wait a minute. Not pass the buck. Respect the War Powers Act. Yeah,
There's no War Powers Act at this point.
Oh, not. That's true. That's true. There isn't.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
yes, he is going to Congress to make the case and get permission. I don't think Congress needs that much of a case made to them. And we haven't talked too much about the domestic kind of politics angle of all of this. But by this point, whether they found themselves through a preparedness path or a war-making path or just kind of beaten down over time, I think by all accounts, the whole room is basically there with him. And they are applauding, cheering as he's starting to make this case. But he makes this turn. He sort of talks about where we are now and the aggression on the part of the Germans, and we need to finally push back. But then he layers on these much bigger ideas, I would say.
Yeah, and that is that the real aim is for peace, that like we make war to achieve peace in some ways. And it's interesting how the crowd only goes like more louder and is cheering even more when he starts talking about keeping the world safe for democracy. And he has this line where he says, we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest in our hearts, democracy. To such a task we can dedicate our lives and our fortunes with pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and peace, which she has treasured. And then he ends by saying, God helping her, she can do no other. I mean, these are powerful words, and it makes sense why people are on their feet. This idea that we're not just going to war for war's sake, we're not just going to war to sort of like bring domination or destruction, that the ultimate goal of war, in the twisted irony, is peace. And democracy is the result of that peace. And so when Americans are fighting, they're thinking of democracy at the forefront as the ultimate goal to be perpetuated, not just in the United States, but really throughout the world.
Yeah.
And he pulls on that. He draws on that example of Russia because, within the past few months, the authoritarian Tsarist government of Russia has been toppled. And he looks at that and he's like, do you not see the way this war can bring peace and democracy? Look at all these wonderful things that are happening in Russia, and the way that not only have the Russians dedicated their people to fighting for freedom, the world, for justice and for peace, but they're making these changes in their own land. He ends his little spiel about Russia with, here's a fit partner for a league of honor. Here is our new ally that is going to help us secure peace and therefore secure democracy.
Yeah. So for a war that started with so many small, convoluted squabbles, and for a U.S. involvement that started with, kind of attacks on passenger ships and then attacks on U-boats, to now be at the point where he's talking about preserving democracy and this larger fight. Is that just the inevitable framing that any U.S. president is going to take? They're going to call back to the founding of our country and these ideals? Or over the course of the time that the U.S. has sort of sat on the sidelines and not jumped in, has the war really become about that? And now all of a sudden the U.S. isn't just punching back when they got some ships sunk, but now actually going out there and preserving democracy for the entire world?
That's a good question.
It's certainly it's certainly how Wilson wants to handle this moment. Like, if we are going to go to war, let's go to war with a bigger goal in mind. And this is kind of where the peace talk gets folded back in. Obviously, the anti-war activists are not happy about the U.S. going to war, but their ideals that there can be a world without war on the other side of this, he is going to fold into his argument. He's going to make this bigger case that there's a future where democracy and peace are flourishing because the United States has gone to war. And I think, almost every presidents always have tied war to some sort of bigger goals, the basic ideals at the core of the American government. I think you see that every single time the U.S. goes to war because it's very effective propaganda.
It's always freedom and democracy. Because no one's going to say for our corporate interests. You know what I mean? No one is going to say for the shareholders. Like, this is...
Although we might be getting there.
Well, yeah, that's true too. But I do think that the idea of freedom and democracy and liberty, I mean, these are big buzzwords that at their heart do a lot of work. If you are going to get buy-in, if you are going to get a feeling that makes people want to join in with you. And these applause, I think, are all sort of like affirmation that this is how people feel about the state of affairs.
Yeah. Though it's funny. I mean, I think, it's fair to say he gets political buy-in, but maybe never moral buy-in. And, even he kind of recognizes that. So look, by all accounts, the response in the room is rapturous. Eventually the vote would be 82-6 to approve the call for war. Even his biggest critic, Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, extends his hand to shake Wilson's hand at the end of the speech. I don't think he does. Wilson just kind of like gets out as quickly as possible. But later that evening, and this is just remarkable, he is talking to his secretary and he allegedly says, remembering all the people who were applauding in that room that night, he says, "Think what it was that they were applauding. My message today was a message of death for our young men. How strange it seems to applaud that." And I don't know. I mean, it's a remarkable thing to hear a president say just after making this speech, but I think it's very reflective of how the country as a whole felt. And, a number of historians have pointed out that, yes, while there was consensus for the war and political approval, by this stage, the national mood was maybe more resignation than, oh, let's do this, let's go to war, it's a just war. And so all of his attempts to sort of frame it in these large moral terms, I just think by this point it's too late, and it's too sort of like death by a thousand cuts, and people are just kind of like, well, I guess we have to do this. I guess we're going to do this. And this is a bit of an aside, though it sets up some of the stuff I want to talk about later. But, I think that's also reflected in like kind of how America never really grapples with the troops who went to war, and we've done episodes about prohibition in the 1920s, and it's just like all these vets who came back, it's a very morally complicated situation for a lot of them, especially, as you were saying last episode, Kelly, given the kind of horrors that they encountered over there.
The horrors of war. Yeah. It is such a game changer for soldiers. And of course, no one at the time had the language or the sort of ideas about how to help people cope coming home from war. It's global in a way that America has sort of not seen either. If you're thinking about the war, the Civil War, that's, something that's fought at home. But this is something very much overseas, very much for the first time. You're having soldiers who are leaving their country for the first time and experiencing something completely different.
Yeah, and you don't have the language yet, but this is where you get the phrase shell shock, because the bombardments are so heavy. There's not language for like PTSD yet, but there's something like that's clearly traumatized these soldiers in a new way, and there's new language that has to develop, and you get like
in the trenches. That's another
the trench warfare, the poetry that comes out of this war and some of the writings. it's not all like glory be to war, like Teddy Roosevelt would have it be. It is like this is what we've done. Like this is what we're fighting for. It's a war that has complications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That said, I mentioned last episode the number one hit song of 1915, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, a pacifist anthem. By the time we get to the summer of 1917, the number one song is Over There,
Over There.
which a lot of people might know. But, you know, it is the song that includes that line, the Yanks are coming, Johnny, get your gun, take it on the run, every son of liberty, hurry right away, no delay, go today. I've heard a lot of really sort of interesting modern interpretations of that as a sort of pacifist song, you know, and a sort of lament. But there is this idea that here we go over there. Let's send our young men to get involved in this war now. So there is a little bit of a rally around the flag for sure. And we're not a war podcast. We don't have to get into too many of the details of how we get involved and how it plays out. But are there any details worth bringing to light about the U.S. involvement?
It is worth noting that there is a rush to enlist. There is also a draft. And so initially, men between the ages of 21 and 30 are required to register for the draft. That's expanded to 18 to 45, in part because so many men are not considered fit once they show up to be drafted. About a third of them are rejected because of their physical health, lack of nutrition, all those kinds of things. 10 million men register for the draft. 2.7 million are drafted. You know, there are millions of Americans who take part in the war in some form or another. It takes, you know, about 9 months to sort of ramp up the capacity to actually in training to send them over to Europe. So they're not actually involved for that long. It's really in early 1918 that U.S. forces are really ramping up, and the war would continue for about another year. There's about 2 million troops just still in the United States waiting to be trained by the time that the war comes to an end.
It is worth pointing out that after the decision to go to war, a lot of these peace activists and a lot of the groups that were opposing the war, there's a crackdown. And, you know, you could in many ways point to the rise of the surveillance state to this moment in 1917 where the government says, okay, you know, Eugene Debs is arrested and imprisoned under the Espionage Act of 1917 for his anti-war speeches. You sort of get the rise of the modern surveillance state. You also get a rise of industrialization, and, you know, there's factories that have to create arms for the war, and the sort of that industrialization was happening anyway. But, you know, looking back at other stories we've done in this series, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which was a result right in this era and was also a result of the rapidly growing industrialization of this moment. So, you know, this is another one of those stories where, like, the war itself is this massive moment, but it's also just this accelerant on all these other trends that are already happening.
Like
Peace
nativism,
movement.
too. Yeah, where people are having an anti-immigrant impulse, which is interesting, too, because at the time, the country is like, you know, 32 million people, or a third of the country are either foreign-born or first-generation or children of immigrants. And so to have that kind of sentiment as well, anti-German sentiment, starts popping up all over the country.
And this really is, it's these are changes that are happening and accelerated by the war. And importantly, they don't end with the war.
Yes.
All of these trends are just, you go into the 1920s and industrialization is going to accelerate even more. We were talking about the rise of the new Klan and immigration restrictions that happened in the 1920s, that increased nativism turns into policy and social movements that far outlast the war. The rise of the FBI in the 1920s and the Palmer raids, all of these things where the state capacity for surveillance has grown during the war. Again, that just gets turned internally after the war. And then, of course, the U.S.'s changing role in the world, which, you know, the U.S. goes to war for peace and they end up coming out of the war a kind of global hegemon.
Yeah. And of course, well, that I don't think Wilson's name is on that building anymore, but, you know, that's where Wilson gets his name on these institutes of peace, right? Is in the aftermath of the war, you have the League of Nations and a conversation about the U.S.'s role in the world. But, you know, you talked about a lot of the, I would say, you know, regressive and repressive forces that emerged during this era or accelerated during this era. But you also have the accelerant on the progressive era. And you have, I think, a bigger class consciousness in this moment. You certainly have a conversation about peace and progressivism that emerges. And so going into the 20s and 30s, we see kind of labor activism start to flourish. We see peace activism start to flourish. All that as a result of this as well, especially as people start to reckon with the horrors of the war as troops come home. That's part of the push and pull in this moment as well. And I would say is at the heart of a lot of the sort of institutionalist efforts in this moment too, right? The League of Nations is drawing on these big ideas about peace and promoting democracy as much as anything.
I mean, there are these big hearings that are held in the 1930s, the Nye Committee, which looks at the role of business in the war. I mean, Kelly, you were talking earlier about how presidents never say that we're going to war to help business. And the Senate looks into this, or the Congress looks into this, and they're like, maybe that's right. And so this becomes this becomes one of the best-selling books of the era is Merchants of Death, which talks about all of these war industries and argues that it's these industries that dragged us into war. And that's why it happened. And so if we can just cut off these war industries, we can prevent future wars. There's actually like a lot of conservatives who will become part of America first and then will become part of the American right in the 1940s and 50s, get their start in this Merchants of Death kind of conversation.
And I mean, you see this model really going forward. Like in some ways, the United States waits and delays to get involved. It keeps its casualty numbers relatively low compared to its allies. And then it's able to sort of capitalize on all of these under industries where it's like, oh, you need weapons. Oh, you need this or that. We've got a guy, and the next thing you know, you can see how U.S. industry benefits tremendously economically from sort of playing bank to Europe, and helping Europe recover in its economic efforts.
Yeah. So before I ask our usual kind of like, should this be a movie? Who should have a statue? All those kinds of questions. The really big question about what this tells us about the forces in American life at the time. This conversation around intervention and peace and isolationism. It feels to me like World War I gets subsumed in two ways. One is now, looking back, knowing that World War II existed, that just kind of the story goes from kind of the late 19th century and then in the, sort of advances through, and we have World War II, and World War I is sort of seen as a stepping stone on the way to World War II. Obviously, at the time, they did not know that World War II was on the way. But I do get the sense that, after the war, we have Prohibition, the suffrage movement, the flu. There were all these domestic conversations that inevitably the war affected them, but it wasn't like that era was defined by the aftermath of what brought us into the war and what transpired during the war as much. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's certainly different than in Europe, right? In Europe, there's this idea of a lost generation and a kind of, if not nihilism, then certainly a deep existentialist soul searching that is happening, and a rebuilding of society that has to grapple with what have we just done to ourselves?
Yeah.
And there isn't that same thing in the United States. In the United States, it's the Roaring '20s and this sense of there is an optimism that is coursing through the U.S. in the 1920s that does not have a kind of counterpart in Europe.
No. I think the 20s, though, is also a decade that's very similar to the 1960s in which you do have a lot of people questioning, people thinking about sort of the social aspects of their lives. I think this is the rise of the Klan is huge in the 1920s. That anti-native sentiment is huge. You do start to get, I would say, a very coalesced white identity in the United States that is different from what is happening in Europe. I think racial lines are really hardening in this moment, in which you don't have a sense of like German American, Italian American, Polish American. Now you have whiteness, which is changing the fabric in ways of American immigrants, of European immigrants that we haven't really seen before. That's not a conversation that's happening in Europe in the same way.
I mean, maybe the big lesson is that we just, or maybe the big, observation and through line is that we just kind of move on from wars pretty quick, right? I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
of the 1980s as sort of a decade of grappling with what happened in Vietnam. I mean, obviously you can tell the story that way, and it probably is that way, but in sort of the story we told ourselves, it was kind of like, we're moving forward. And same with, I've lived through it. I don't think we ever had the real deep conversation about what the Iraq War did to us.
Oh my gosh,
We're
no.
living with the fallout now for sure. But
yes.
and so maybe it's only actually World War II, the good war, that you can kind of say like, well, the 50s were about sort of basking in the glow of what we accomplished. Otherwise, we just come out of these things and we move on and sort of push those feelings down.
And even in the case of World War II, like basking in the glow of what we accomplished, but also basking in the glow of the mushroom cloud, right?
Yeah.
Like so much of that anxiety comes out of the end of World War II as well.
Yeah.
So just war is hell, and the aftermath of war is also just a disaster.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Statues, movies, series, all the usual questions we ask as we get to the end of these two-parters. Jeanette Rankin has a building named after her. I think she's mostly known as a women's rights person, not necessarily as a peace activist. But, that's pretty good.
Part of her thing, though. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely part of her thing. Teddy Roosevelt's got some shine. Wilson's got some shine. La Follette, our Wisconsin progressive anti-war activist. I think he's still a hero in the Midwest, but maybe, I don't know.
I think he's having a return moment.
Yeah. I'm going to throw out there someone who we did not mention at all, which I make sure to always tell my students about, a Black man from Georgia named Eugene Bullard, who cannot serve in the United States military because of segregation and racism. And he goes over to France and he enlists in France and he becomes one of the first combat aviators. He's a pilot and he does so much combat, like, bombs and helps out the efforts. Like France gives him their highest honor possible. I mean, he's got like a list, like a page long of awards and commendations that he's won for his bravery and for his courage. And he's just this incredible man who actually comes back to the United States and dies an elevator operator. And I'm like, what? And it's just, to me, I'm just like, if there are unsung heroes, people like Eugene Bullard certainly deserve a statue for their efforts. If not a little miniseries.
There are also a handful of Asian immigrants who participate in the war, and then after the war are given kind of a carve out to get citizenship because they were denied citizenship based on the fact that they were Asian. And then their citizenship later gets stripped away again in the build-up to World War II and the anti-Japanese sentiment of that period. So there's a way that war kind of opens the possibility for greater citizenship and greater recognition, which a lot of Black Americans will be fighting for in the 1920s, and they'll use their war service to try to open that door, but that door does not stay open very long.
Yeah. Movies and TV shows, I mean, obviously, like...
We've got some.
Yeah, there's been some, right? All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah.
Lawrence of Arabia. Shout out to Peter Weir's Gallipoli, one of my favorite movies by my favorite director. There was 1917, not that long ago. I think War Horse. Didn't see it. I think War Horse was a World War I movie. I think there's a horse in it.
There's a horse
There's
in
a
it.
war.
Yeah.
There's a war and a horse.
Getting fewer of those by the time you get to World War II.
Yes,
So World War I is
yeah,
really
exactly.
a big horse war.
TV series. I mean, obviously, like, there's some Downton Abbey touches on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff about this era. I will once again use the occasion to point out that I recently rewatched Boardwalk Empire, one of my favorite shows, and maybe my favorite character in that is a World War I vet, and so much that you learn through his character is just about the many ways people were just not grappling with the aftermath of the war. So I think, pretty well saturated, though I don't think, in all of these, I certainly think this was the horrors of this war are usually the first thing. I don't think there was a robust peace movement in the run up to this war is necessarily part of all these series.
Yeah, we don't spend a lot of time on World War I in the same way that we do World War II. I mean, there's not a sense of nostalgia for this war in the way that World War II manifests itself, and I think because of that, there's a tendency to sort of skip over or like, oh yeah, that happened anyways, and we just don't sit with it, and that's part of the problem too, that I feel like keep coming back to these things because we don't sit with it.
Yeah. And the sort of at the heart of it all was that sort of deep ambivalence and reluctance. We're talking, I can reveal it now on this episode, but we're talking in a few days. We're going to have a bonus episode coming with the great Ken Burns, and we're going to talk to him about how he's processing America 250. We're going to run some of that in this feed. We're going to run the full thing for paying subscribers of our newsletter. So if you want to hear the full conversation with Ken Burns, go ahead and subscribe there. But I will tell you, the first question I have for Ken Burns is, why haven't you done a World War I documentary? You basically touched on every other episode. I'm very curious to hear if he sort of reflects any of the things we've been talking about here in terms of why he hasn't gone full on and done World War I as a series. He's a busy guy, so, we excuse him.
He's got a few things on his plate, a little.
But I'm looking forward to that, and I really, really loved this conversation. So that brings us to the end of week 13 of 50 Weeks That Shaped America, on the run-up and the wretched decision to enter World War I. Coming up on the show, in addition to our bonus conversation with Ken Burns, and we've got some other really cool bonus conversations on the way as well, we're going to talk next week about Martin Luther King. In future weeks, we're going to talk about the Bay of Pigs, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hard Hat Riot, all sorts of stuff coming down the line. Once again, if you want access to everything we make, sign up as a paying member of our newsletter, thisdaypod.com. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network of independent, artist-produced, listener-supported podcasts. Don't forget to sign up for our America 250 Watch newsletter. Every Thursday, you'll get exclusive access to analysis and information about the semi-quincentennial, commentary from our team, and a list of fascinating things that happened that week throughout history. And on Sundays, for our paid subscribers, you get early, ad-free access to our 50 Weeks That Shaped America series, plus other bonus conversations throughout the year. Join in, find out lots more, support the show at thisdaypod.com. You can also follow This Day Pod on Instagram, Blue Sky, and on YouTube. Get in touch with ideas or feedback at thisdaypod@gmail.com. Jacob Feldman is our researcher. Kala Nakua does our transcripts. Special thanks to Audrey Martovich, Yuri Lasordo, and everyone at Radiotopia. Extra special thanks to you for listening, subscribing, rating and reviewing, and telling others about the show. My name is Jody Abergan. We'll see you soon.